A year into the COVID pandemic, Asian Americans come to grips with a surge of racist slurs and violent attacks. From racist taunts, rants to physical assault, thousands of cases have been reported in recent months. No wonder U.S. President Joe Biden signed a memorandum to tackle anti-Asian hate and violence. Celebrities and activists are now on board, using their fame to stop the hate and to call for racial justice. What's behind the rising tide of anti-Asian violence, and how can the U.S. ensure the safety and rights of Asian American community? Let's loop in our panelists. Joining us in New York, Anthony Chen, former J.P. Morgan Chase chief economist in Los Angeles; William Li, chief economist from Milken Institute in Beijing; Teng Jimeng, professor from the Center for American Studies with Beijing Foreign Studies University. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. What is going on with the hate crimes? Why there is such a sharp rise of them? For example, Mr. Chen, in Los Angeles, the increase is more than 110% 2020 compared to 2019. What happened?
We've gotten a lot of publicity that the virus started in China, and somehow that message is going in the wrong direction, and somehow it's being connected to Asian Americans. As a proud Chinese American, it saddens me to hear this, but whereas I live here in New York City, the news is suggesting that hate crimes against Asian Americans is up over 800%. And the thing to keep in mind, it's not just Chinese Americans. The hate crime is against basically all Asian Americans, because they're all considered by the people committing these hate crimes as all coming from China, which is extremely sad.
Mr. Li, what about in your part of the world, near Maryland, Virginia, Washington, D.C.?
There's a very large Asian community here, Vietnamese, South Asian, as well as quite a number of Han Chinese who are come here to work at NIH and a lot of the professional organizations. The reported crimes are less here because the newspapers seem to pick up less of that news, but I know that there are many more incidents now than there were before. But I should say that crimes of this sort against minorities is very typical of a response when a country is under some kind of duress, some kind of fear, and whether it was 9/11 and the backlash against the Middle Eastern people, or during World War II, the backlash against the Japanese Americans. This kind of extreme desire to find blame and to assign blame is something that is very characteristic of a country that is in a crisis. And we see this not only in the United States, but we also see it in Europe as well.
What the law enforcement agencies are doing? How are they tracking, recording, and also helping at this point? Much at all? Mr. Chen, your knowledge.
My impression is that not all the crimes are reported, and therefore if they're not reported, it's very difficult for the law enforcement to actually do something about it. And it sort of reminds me of something that Albert Einstein once said. It's not so much the evil in the world that's taking place. The real evil is what occurs when people see evil and they just look on and they don't report it. And I think that's the situation with the hate crimes. We need to report it so that it can be tabulated and law enforcement actually can take action. But I think that one of the things that really distresses me quite a bit is that there are 7 states in the United States that don't even have a hate crime law. So in those states, when these things happen, they don't even have a way of categorizing these things because they don't have hate laws on the books. So I think we have to raise awareness. I think the fact that the President of the United States signed an executive order in his first 2 weeks in his administration against Asian Americans is a step in the right direction. So my hope and expectation is that as we move forward, that these things will in fact be addressed. But I think Bill is spot on in saying that these things occur when a country is under duress. I think he's 100% correct.
I'm afraid I'm less optimistic than Anthony about the ability of law enforcement to contain some of this violence. We've now gone through a huge political turmoil in this country, And there's a large movement to defund the police, to reduce the funding for law enforcement agencies. And I find that difficult to understand in this kind of environment where we now have to rely more than ever on law enforcement. And instead, we see there are prosecutors in Los Angeles who refuse to enforce laws. We see the police handicapped by a fear of being accused of being racially profiling. So I think one of the things that we as Asians have to face up to is that we have to rely on ourselves more, and we need to somehow make it aware that the defunding of the law enforcement agencies is causing us, the victims, more harm than good.
Professor Tang, we, over the past few months, have been hearing about Chinese American communities inside the United States, in order to avoid being attacked, have to form their community alliance, that they have this app among themselves. So once one family is under attack, the others are taking up the things that they can and try to come over and help. But how much hope shall we pin upon that kind of community help? After all, we do need law enforcement.
I agree with my fellow two panelists. I think that right now, the circumstances can be very dire in terms of this very crisis under which Asian Americans are suffering, this very lack of protection from the law enforcement. And so I agree with both of them that Asian Americans need to rely on themselves more to fend off the attack, to fend off the hate crime that is now prevailing in communities around the country. But then self-reliance is just one way out. Institutionalized sort of hate crime or discrimination must be dealt with institutionally. And so in this sense, I would strongly actually argue for, again, this institutional protection, the reliance on the law enforcement, and that needs the country, the government's systematic effort. I am glad that the President Biden signed directives actually in actually providing more protections and to contain this crime, and especially the crime originated from this very sort of a scapegoating. I think scapegoating in the U.S. Is particularly kind of a disastrous, especially in the current situation, a country caught up in this very crisis.
Mr. Lee, earlier you talked about you are less optimistic than your colleague, Mr. Chen. But are you seeing that the law enforcement's willingness to implement, for example, the executive order and the basic responsibility to protect everyone, including Asian Americans?
Yeah, there's been a huge shift in the way prosecutors view their job. The classic example is what's happened in Los Angeles, where the district attorney is refusing to prosecute criminals because they feel that many of the criminals themselves have been victimized by society. And in order to right that wrong, they feel that we should not cause that victimization to occur twice, even though they committed a crime. Many of the prosecutions are not being pursued. And I think that's a travesty. And as much as I would love to agree with Professor Song about the need for institutions to enforce the law, these institutions are selectively choosing not to enforce the laws that are on the books, and putting more laws on the books is not going to help matters. And when the police themselves are asked to do something, when we reduce the funding for the police departments around the country, then we are left even more naked to the aggression of crazy people.
How strong, Mr. Chen, is this issue should be of concern, the so-called selective racial equity? In other words, at one time, paying more attention to the protection and the civil rights of one ethnic group, while at the same time ignoring, not necessarily on purpose, but might be the result, the others. We have seen, African Americans' rights have been more being mentioned in the media, certainly much more paid attention by the law enforcement. But now we see as such a huge problem with the protection of Asian Americans in the U.S. society. What do you make of that?
Racism should have no color. That is, everyone should be protected against racism, whether it's African Americans, whether it's Asian Americans, whether it's Greek Americans. All Americans should be protected against racism. Of course, that's an ideal situation, and if you defund the police, that's going to be a little bit more challenging. Although bills suggest that correctly, that you have some prosecutors around the country choosing not to enforce the laws as rigorously as they should, that does not mean that that's going to continue indefinitely. I grew up in the inner cities, and some of the people that I grew up with still tell me that in the inner cities, poor public housing projects where I grew up, there are a lot of people there that are suffering from this this situation that is going on. So my hope and expectation is that several years from now, as many of these individuals realize that they're suffering, that we will see the pendulum move in the other direction, and we will once again start to protect everybody against these crimes. When you see stories of a 91-year-old Asian American being thrown to the ground and being hit from behind, that to me is not even a hate crime. That's murder, or attempted murder at the very least. That has to be enforced against Asian Americans, against African Americans, against Hispanic Americans, against anybody, because they're human beings, and human beings need to be protected.
Mr. Tang, there has been a lot of talk in the media now about the protection of Asian Americans, and there seems to be increasing awareness. But what do you think is the fundamental issue here? Earlier, two gentlemen touched on, the role of the leadership. The former president of the United States wrongly repeated suggesting that the virus is related to one geographical location, China, even though the WHO research had been demonstrating that it is coming from the animal world to the human world. So now, despite all of this corrections by scientists, by the media, by experts, there are people just going to take advantage of this all the time. So Professor Tang, have we seen that before? What does it take to change?
These old habits die hard. Some people just cannot change their mind because of ignorance. Ignorance is the major roadblock to understanding and to achieve a fair and also just understanding of the issue prevailing now around the world. And so I think in addition to the role played by the leaders and by the government, by authorities at various levels, teachers, educators, law enforcement officers, and lawyers and bankers, all people need to be involved. I think that right now it's high time we have a massive campaign around the world, in particular countries, in the US and in China perhaps, that we actually need to launch a campaign to educate, to highlight, to enlighten people, and so that we can cleanse all these sundry imperfections of our societies. The United States actually used to be a beacon light for people, people around the world. But now I think during this very time of crisis, we need to sit down, and we need to sit down with educators, and educators sit down with students in the classroom environment, in the community environment, hold more town hall meetings, and try to actually identify these issues. Because hate crime is not just a crime, it's also a psychological sort of, it produces psychological impact. I think that right now, the people of color in the US are traumatized. This very trauma can have a long-lasting impact on their psyche, because trauma actually destroys the very meaning, the very fabric of meaning of culture and value. And in fact, it will eventually, in a sense, destroy the attachment, the emotional attachment, the emotional attachment of people to that very community that they love, the country they love, and also the race of which they feel very proud of.
But this is not just over the past 4 years. This has been a deep-rooted problem of racial equity in the U.S. And Asian Americans are not just being attacked now, but also during other times, it's just that the media spotlight is not down there yet at that time. So, Mr. Lee, would you expect fundamental change? Would you expect real constructive solutions, or only one-time thing?
Human nature is very difficult to change, and it really has to change on an individual level and on a family level. You have to be taught what proper behavior is in public. And I think one of the things that we should look at for policy is that the fastest way to alleviate the violence against Asians is to alleviate the source of distress in society, which is the lockdown and economic hardship that's been imposed by the measures, the health policy measures to counteract the virus. And I think we've gotten a lot of attention about Asians because Asians have historically been a silent minority. We have been able to become successful in American society because we have been able to achieve individually, and we've been able to do so in a very quiet fashion. Now that the violence is turned against us because of a prehistoric way of naming diseases. I mean, after all, diseases were named for Spanish flu, Ebola, Lyme disease. They were geographically based naming conventions that are very hard to change in the popular nomenclature. And unfortunately, that naming nomenclature has now assigned Asians as a source of distress. So to alleviate the violence against Asians quickly, rather than finding some way to change human nature, which I don't believe can happen by legislation or by fiat, we need to alleviate the distress, which is get the vaccines out, get people vaccinated, open up the economy, and let people work again. When people are working and able to earn income and conduct their lives, they're not going to go after Asians in the kind of violent fashion that they have now because of that dismay that the Asians caused them economic distress. Incorrectly, but nevertheless, that association is there. So to me, the fastest alleviation for Asian violence is to get the economy working again.
My last question. You know, recently there are a lot of things going on inside the United States. Also, for example, the girl reading the poem at the inauguration ceremony that the media blasted in a way, and also recently Billie Holiday's movie about her insisting on singing Strange Fruit, which of course is a song describing the racial problem in the United States at her time was extremely difficult. We see a lot of cultural products coming out about African Americans fighting against racial discrimination in the U.S. How much can we expect that the same attention spotlight will also focus on Asian Americans? By the way, all Americans should be protected, and all actually in other parts of the world should be protected. But Professor Tang, as a cultural expert, how do you see that?
I applaud the young lady who actually recited her own poem on that very day of Mr. Biden's inauguration. I actually was so very much moved and touched by her courage and also her bravery in addressing the issue and in issuing such a call to put an end to the very polite that African Americans are suffering, or racial or minorities were suffering right now in the United States, especially during the 4 years of Trump administration. I myself actually cited lots of these historical texts, including musical text and also filmic text. If you look back at my bookshelf, you see Bob Dylan. Bob Dylan used to be a major subject matter I taught in my class, and who was also known for a major voice against racial discrimination in the 1960s. His several songs are often cited as examples, like Haiti Carol, Blowing in the Wind. All these great songs are actually being taught here in China, and I'm sure in classroom in the United States, to address these issues. And so once again, I believe artists should be standing up. Artists like the young lady should stand up against this very violence, this very violation, so that the nation may be heeding the call, I mean, to end this particular duress and also stress. And so once again, I think back in Asian Chinese tradition, scholars are often held up as the philosopher or the scholar king, leading the nation out of trouble, out of crisis. Now I would rely And I'm hoping that the artists, again, like what the artists have done in the 60s, like Bob Dylan had done, like the Beatles, and like Joan Baez, I mean, stand up against these violations, stand up against these crimes, and raise the awareness of the very destructive impact of those crimes.
There are a lot of reminiscence, certainly in your answer, Mr. Tang, if I could point out that. Mr. Lee, also I'd like to address that question to you. We've seen quite a number of popular productions about Asian Americans, about Asians as well. For example, The Rich Asians or something like that, that have been very popular. Even though we've seen back in the 1980s and 90s, there were things like Joy Luck Club and other things that's trying to create much more of a bridge understanding the Asian culture or the Asian American culture. What have changed? And how do you think that atmosphere is going to cultivate the understanding of Asia, of Asian Americans, and of their cultures?
The first wave of artists that you just mentioned did a lot to bring awareness of what Asian life is like in the United States. But unfortunately, it's a very stylized picture of overachievers and super rich people. What we need is a Chinese or Asian American Spike Lee, someone who would produce a film of the way Auntie and I grew up. I grew up in Chinatown in New York City, and I grew up among gangs. I grew up among people who were going to be destined to go to jail the minute they graduate high school. And at the same time, the people around them were also overachievers who went and got Nobel Prizes. So that dichotomy of life within the Chinatowns of the United States, films can be made to bring out that we Asian Americans are human. We have all sorts of different people, good and bad, and overachievers and underachievers. And I think to widen the perspective for Americans, non-Asian Americans, about who Asian Americans are is needed. And filmmakers like Spike Lee did that tremendously for the Black people. And I think we need similar artists here as well for Asians.
With that note, I would like to thank the three of you for a very resourceful conversation. Anthony Chen, William Lee, and Teng Jimeng. Really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
The world is changing fast, taking all our lives with it. But we can change it too, by seeking answers to problems through discussions and debates. On World Insight, I ask direct questions to real people in the know, seek genuine answers, but respect diverse perspectives. Our live global debates tackle the most critical issues head-on. World Insight with Tian Wei go beyond the headlines.
Welcome back. You're still watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Way down with deadly pandemic and tense geopolitics, the world has become more divided than ever. And the boundaries on how far jokes can go for laughs has been pushed from sharp wit to outright offensive. Joe Wang, a well-known Asian American stand-up comedian, has been an active voice for Asians against the systemic racism in the U.S. He has slammed the white supremacists and initiated a petition to include the Asian American story in the U.S. textbooks. He was also invited to the White House Correspondent Dinner, where he roasted then Vice President, now President Joe Biden. What's the punchline in reflection in a year marred by both COVID and discrimination against Asians? Can he, Joe Wang, win over a tough crowd, or will his campaign fall flat? I visited him, and our conversation starts with some of the latest development. Joe, I noticed that from last year I talked to you, I think it was in the spring, 2020. Yeah. You were not laughing and joking as often as you did before anymore. You are really serious. I know you're a serious guy to begin with, but you decorated well before. And now I think
hide it well.
I hide it really well. But now I think there are so many things that you have to digest, both as one with conscience, an individual with conscience, and also an individual who is having people laugh as your best ultimate goal. I think you are quieter than before, if I noticed right.
Oh, thank you. I guess I just found my conscience in back 2020. That would be my biggest gain. No, no, just kidding. No.
1 year is already enough.
Yeah. But during all these craziness, it makes everyone think. One thing I've been thinking is how come one phrase from the President of the United States could cause so much harm to the Asian American community in America?
Did you figure out the answer?
I think the answer is as long as countries don't respect each other, there will be racism in America. Racism in America is not a domestic issue. As long as people like Trump are calling another country shithole countries, once you have this kind of public discourse, there's got to be discrimination, So I think words from the leader of a country matters a lot. And also, this kind of discrimination is the legacy of hundreds of years of colonialism. I remember when I was doing comedy in Boston, there was a comedian, he's Indian American, but he talks about colonialism. Mm-hmm. At the time, I was like, why are you talking about this? This is such an old...
Also a deep topic, right?
A deep topic, but also it was so many years ago. Who cares about it anymore? But then later on, I realized that a lot of these racism is actually handed down from colonialism. Colonialism, basically, you conquer another country...
with hard power.
Yeah, with hard power, but then you just treat people in other countries as if they're inferior. Then that kind of mindset is still there. So as long as countries don't treat each other on equal footing, it's hard for people within the country to be, treated equally.
Anything have changed? You were talking about racism, but you talk about it in a way in such a daily life at that time.
Yeah.
At that time, now in reflection, so quiet and peaceful, isn't it?
Oh yeah. During Obama years, people probably didn't feel that way, but after Trump took office, you look back, it was like, wow, those were such, nicer times, But then, of course, there were things we can improve even upon those times, Especially for Asian Americans, they still don't have a good representation in American politics and entertainment. I did a show for a fundraiser back in January 2020, almost a year ago. After the show, I remember this white lady came up to me and said, "Oh, thank you for the comedy routine. I didn't know there was an Exclusion Act." It was such an important thing in Asian American history, but a lot of people just don't even know it. So I think it is important for comedians to incorporate certain history or their own culture, infuse it into their comedy.
Sounds like there are a lot of issues that have not resolved along the way, and they piled up one after another, and this is where we are.
Yes. Trump might be the one straw that broke the camel's back, because without years or even centuries of accumulation of this racism, one phrase from him wouldn't cause so much harm. But then, you look back, you just realize that, in schools, corporations, even entertainment places, racism toward Asian Americans is very well received, very well accepted. People just think, oh, that's the way it is.
They didn't even realize.
Exactly. I even have Asian Americans who grew up in America saying to me, "Hey, you're lucky you grew up in China." I said, "Why?" He just said, because even since school, there's just so much racism toward Asians that are tolerated. There's so many examples. There's a Vietnamese kid who failed math, and he's asking his teacher if the math teacher can help him out. The math teacher said, "Oh, too many of you are successful. you have to take one for the team. That's, oh man, there's so many of these stories, just heartbreaking. But all these were shoved under the rug. And once people feel, oh, it's okay to be racist and open again, all this stuff just came up.
You know, for comedians, one of the tricks that you have is to make stereotypes. And break the stereotypes, right? But here is the seriousness and also sensitivity of racism. How are you going to articulate that in your creation of jokes?
It's trial and error. You just have to always try these jokes and see what people can take. But of course, you can't always just tell jokes that people feel comfortable with. Then you're not telling the truth. Right. So it's always a balance thing.
But will you allow other comedians to test that with you? For example, as an Asian American?
I wish there were more comedians who would test that with me. But in most cases, comedians from other ethnic backgrounds, they would just say certain things without even asking the Asian people how they would feel. And that's been the problem for years. I witnessed the situation where something happened. You know, all these white and black comedians are thinking, oh, will this be offensive to Asian people? And there's one Asian guy sitting right there. Nobody's asking him.
It's right there, just ask him.
Yeah, I know, no.
Transparent guy.
Yeah. The same thing with their television shows. They will have an Asian character, but in the whole writing room, there's no Asian writers. So nobody knows what the Asian sensitivity is. And they just make things up. As long as people are laughing, it's fine. So over the years, they reinforced a lot of Asian stereotypes. Yeah.
How did you do that?
I think this is not my standard, but then another comedian said this. I think it makes a lot of sense.
Tell me more.
When you write a joke, you just picture, if you write a joke about Asian people, for example, you just picture there's an Asian person right there. Can you say this to his face? If you can say this to his face and he's okay with it, then it's probably an okay joke. But otherwise, don't just try to think that, oh, I just hope there's no Asian in the audience tonight. That's why if a new comedian tells an offensive joke, I always give this person more benefit of the doubt. Because he's new, he's testing things out. But if it's a person who's done this like for years and he's still doing these racist material, then he's just a racist.
Will things change much, you think?
I hope so.
On the surface or in real essence?
You know what? I'm just hoping we can at least change on the surface. I've been telling people, hypocrisy is the best we can hope for. Because at least
that's a nice line, by the way.
Yeah, at least in hypocrisy, people are pretending to be something. They at least acknowledge something is nice, and we pretend to be that.
You're watching World Insight. Coming up in the program, in the interview series, Hong Kong Outlook. After a symposium on the city's electoral system, let's hear from a former SAR Legislative Council president. Stay tuned. How will China innovate? Where do the Chinese spend their money on? How will China fulfill its promise for carbon neutrality? And what will China do next for pandemic prevention and control? China's annual political season this year focuses on the blueprint of the country's next 5 years. I will bring you up close to the two sessions to feel the pulse of this dynamic place and note the nuance of its evolution. This is World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. Today we'll continue our special interview series, Hong Kong Outlook, with Hong Kong SAR prominent figures. Representatives from the Special Administrative Region spoke during a two-day symposium on the need to improve the city's electoral systems. Rita Fan, former president of the Hong Kong SAR Legislative Council, said carrying out the principle of patriots governing Hong Kong is the original aspiration of the one country, two systems, and the legislative intent of the Hong Kong SAR Basic Law. With the latest changes to the law, what's in store for Hong Kong? Last year, I interviewed her on Hong Kong issue. Take a listen.
they are going to cause trouble, and I don't want to be caught in trouble. When I walk on the street, if I come across them, I will keep my mouth shut, because just in case I say something that is disagreeable with them, they will hit me, harm me. Our freedom, our human right, our freedom of expression, my right to go to any place in Hong Kong that I feel I want to go, these are all compromised because of their so-called pro-democracy and freedom movement. Well, it is not. I have to tell you, it is not a pro-democracy or seeking freedom. Their freedom is the freedom for them only. Everybody else has to give way to what they want to do. We needed that kind of protection. We need to know what is happening in Hong Kong, and at least we can take some precaution so that it doesn't get out of hand. I'm afraid that at the present moment, things have got out of hand. A normal person like me, a retiree, when I want to go to a shopping mall during weekend, in the past I can go whichever shopping mall I like. Now I dare not.
How will Hong Kong repair its wounds as a result of political division, as a result of what happened over the past year, as a result of what is still going on right now in the streets, as a result of a very divided society? Mrs. Fan, how is Hong Kong going to do that?
First of all, I think we like to go back to our normal life where we can work and play as we used to. Secondly, the economy of Hong Kong has already suffered a very, very big blow. So for Hong Kong's economy to recover, it will take some time, and we will have to work on it. We are determined to live the life we want to live. We want one country, two systems. And that system, as prescribed by the Basic Law, will continue on to work in Hong Kong. We will make sure, because it is our daily life, it is our livelihood. You know, for people who are not in Hong Kong and who are making all kinds of comments about Hong Kong, they don't have to pay any price if Hong Kong goes down the drain. But for a person living in Hong Kong, we are paying all the price for all their so-called ideology, or so-called dominance of the world, or so-called democracy, which destroys democracy itself. I hope that they will understand. But if they don't, we will still go on, because we are determined to make our home a livable place.
That's all the time we have for today's program. If you'd like to see more, search World Insight or check out our YouTube channel. You can also follow us on Twitter and Facebook. I'm Tian Wei. On behalf of the team, thanks for watching. Bye for now.